Hello everybody and welcome back to the Virtual World series. In this video we're going to be setting up the game loop as well as a few other things that we're going to need for running our game in the browser. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that your project is opened in Visual Studio Code, and then we're going to go to the JS folder here and we're going to create a new folder inside of this folder and we're going to call it game. Now inside of this folder is where we're going to have all the scripts that contain the implementation for our game for the browser. So we're going to be using JavaScript for the client, as I already discussed a little bit earlier in the series, and in this video we're going to set up the basic framework that we're going to use for running the game. So in this folder we're going to create a new file and we're going to call it game.js, and this is where the gameplay is going to be managed from. So all of the things that happen in the game is going to come one way or another from code inside this file. So now that we have that, we're going to want to go ahead and include this file in our main page. So we'll go back to index.php, and right below our panel here, we're going to write a script include to make sure that that script is in our page. Okay, perfect. So that include is now in there. So we can now get started with the game.js file. So we're going to need a few variables here that we're going to have at the top of the file, and these are going to hold some important variables that we're going to need. This includes the canvas element from HTML from DOM, and it's also going to include the canvas's context that we're going to need for drawing. So let's go ahead and define those real quick. The next thing we're going to want to do is create a few more variables that are related to time. So basically how games work is based on something called frames, and we're going to get into that in just a second. So we're going to want three variables. We're going to want a variable that can hold the current time, which is the time in that frame. We're going to want to hold the time of the last frame, and then a variable to hold delta time, which will be used by various functions in the game. Now that we have those variables, we can go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to want to do is write our main game loop. So as you may know from playing video games and stuff like that, you may have seen the term FPS. And the reason for that is code inside of games runs in something called frames. And there's usually so many frames per second. Depending on how good your hardware is, you could have more. The standard frame per second for things like movies and shows and stuff like that is 30 frames per second. That's probably all we're going to really need for a browser game, but in just a second I'm going to touch on the fact that we're actually not going to use FPS as a metric because it's not really current. So we can finally get to implementing our game loop. So you may be asking yourself what a game loop actually is. You may have heard of the term frame, and what that basically means is code runs in something called a frame in games, and these frames happen so many times per second. This is called frames per second. The code that runs in this frame is ran in something called a game loop. So a game loop is an endless loop. It just keeps running over and over and over again, and it takes things like user input and other external factors, and then it draws on the screen based on those factors, and it manages all the game mechanics are handled through the game loop. For this reason, because the game loop runs so many times and ran so many times per second, you want it to make sure that it is as efficient as possible. Now in the browser, it's not as big of a deal because we're not going to be hugely performance based, but for something like, let's say like a AAA game, this is a huge point. Optimization in the game loop is key, but in the browser, we're going to want to make sure we have it fairly optimized, but we're not going to need to dedicate a bunch of time into trying to optimize it at the expense of clean code. So let's go ahead and start implementing our game loop. So we're going to write it in a function called runGameLoop. And inside this function, we're going to want to do a couple things. We're going to want to keep track of the time, like I talked about with defining these variables, and we're going to want to handle user input and other external factors such as other players in an update call, and then we're going to want to draw that all to the screen and request another frame. So first, let's keep track of the time. So we'll want to know what time that frame is running. That way we can keep track of how much time has passed since the last frame. So basically what we're doing here is using the date object for JavaScript and using getTime to get the time of the current frame in milliseconds. And next we're going to want to set the delta time so that we know how much time has passed since the last frame. So the reason we're dividing it by 1,000 here is because as I said before, the date.getTime is actually in milliseconds, and we want to get it in seconds because that is how we're going to be determining units when doing things like moving the player. We're going to be doing it by units per second, not units per millisecond, so that's why we're dividing it by 1,000. The next thing we're going to want to do is set up an update call. Now this is going to be, oh, okay, that's definitely not what we want. I don't know why I did that. So right now this function is going to be blank, but we are going to update this later on in the tutorial series. The next thing we're going to want to do is draw, and that's going to be, we're going to touch more on that in the next video. And then after that, we're going to want to set the last time to the current time, because what this is basically going to do is, this is the core of the game loop. Once this code has ran, we can set the last frame time to this frame time, because immediately after this we're going to be jumping to the next frame, and that brings us to request animation frame run game loop. Now in the past there's been a lot of tutorials and stuff for writing HTML5 games that have used the set interval function, and this is considered dated. It's not really efficient. The CPU usage will go high even when you're not tabbed into the browser, so we don't want to use that, and there's other reasons. But basically, request animation frame is like the newer way that pretty much every modern browser supports to be able to run game loops. So finally, we need to actually run this game loop. So we're going to want to make sure the page is loaded though before we run this, because the game is going to happen inside of an HTML canvas, which I talked a bit about in the last video, and we want to make sure that canvas is actually rendered before we start running the game loop. So to do this, we can actually add an event listener on the load event to make sure the page is loaded before we start requesting an animation frame. So to do this, we can use the add event listener function. And in here, we're going to use that same call, request animation frame, to kick off our loop. Now, we're going to want to call another function in this frame, and we're going to go ahead and define that function up here. So that function is going to be called start, and this is going to run any initialization routines that we want to run before the game loop starts running. So this is going to include things like setting the canvas element and the canvas context. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So we're going to want to set the canvas element to that of the canvas element that we have right here. Now you can see I've set an ID tag in the element, and I've set it to canvas. So how I'm going to go ahead and get that element is by using the getElementById function provided by JavaScript. So now we have the canvas element, but we also need the canvas context, because that's what's going to be used for a lot of the drawing and stuff that happens. So we're going to want to set this canvas variable to the canvas element, and then we can go ahead and get the context by using the getContext function. And we're going to want the, okay, that's not what I wanted, getContext. I don't really know why it's trying to autocomplete that for me. And we're going to want the 2D context. So let's go ahead and set up the update and draw calls. So these are going to be kind of filler right now. They're not going to have anything very important, but these are going to be huge in the next couple tutorials that are coming up. So the update function, we're just going to leave blank. We're just going to put a blank function here. The draw function won't be blank, but it won't really have much either. You won't really see a difference when you go into the browser. And what we're just going to make it do right now is clear the canvas. So let's talk about this function for a second. Why would we want to clear the canvas? And why are we using canvas element.width and height? Well, basically what this function does is it clears all of the pixels that have been set in the canvas for width and height, and by using canvas element.width and .height, that basically clears the entire canvas. And the reason we want to do this is every frame that we draw, we're going to want to redraw. And the reason for that is, let's say our player moves, it'll have their drawings from the previous frames if we don't clear the rectangle, and it'll get really weird and it'll look terrible. So that's why we're going to clear the canvas on every draw call. So down at the event listener, we're just going to add the start function call in there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're not using FPS and why we're using milliseconds per frame. So we're measuring how many seconds or milliseconds have passed between frames, and what that's called is milliseconds per frame, rather than FPS. And FPS is starting to get kind of a bad rep for modern games because it's not incredibly accurate. There's a lot of loss in interpreting that because it can change drastically very quickly, whereas milliseconds per frame is a lot more accurate and can make things more smooth. So that's why we're using milliseconds per frame and not frames per second. And the other thing I wanted to touch on was why we're adding an event listener for load and why we're not just doing window.onload equals function blah blah blah. And you've probably seen this before, and the reason for that is we don't want to just clobber the onload function. By adding our own gracefully, we don't interfere with anything else that may happen in the browser. In the next video, we're going to implement player movement. We're going to have a player being drawn on the screen and clicking around will move it. But in order to get to that, we needed to get this over with first. And these components are kind of important to talk about, so that's why I wanted to talk about them before going into that. So finally, we just want to go ahead and add some comments to our code to make sure that it's more maintainable. So to do that, we can just go ahead and add a / comment. And I'm going to add a comment for the variables just stating what they hold. Perfect. I'm just going to remove that space. And then we're going to want to go ahead and comment what the start function actually does. So that comment just basically states that the start function initializes this canvas element and it will eventually set up event handlers that we're going to set up later on. The update function is just going to simply, so here I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between the update function and the draw function. So both of them are called in the game loop every frame, but the draw function is used for, well, running draw calls to the canvas, and update is used for handling logic. So we want to state that in a comment, that way if anyone else goes to maintain our code, or if we go back to maintain our code, we know what's going on here. Okay, perfect, and now we can just comment the draw function. Now we just want to go ahead and comment that the game loop runs once per frame. So let's comment what's actually going on inside the game loop. So I just added a few comments inside the game loop explaining what's going on, saying that this top portion is for getting the delta time between this frame and the last frame, and that this handles all the logic and drawing for that one frame instance, and that this is basically advancing to the next frame. So now that we've commented all our code, we're good to go ahead and push this to GitHub, so let's go ahead and do that now. Perfect, so we can just go ahead and add the index.php, add index.php, and we're also going to add the game.js file. And then we can just go ahead and make a commit saying we've set up the game loop. So in this video, we have set up the basic framework for how we're going to be running our game with the game loop and the update and draw calls, and we've added some comments to our code, and we now have it pushed to GitHub. In the next video, we're going to be handling the player and moving around and drawing it on the canvas. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. If you did, please leave a like below, comment any questions or comments you guys may have on the video, and subscribe. And I will see you guys in the next video where we will be handling player drawing and moving around the player on the canvas using the mouse.